Allow me to welcome all of you to Museum Island here in Berlin. Museum Island is instigated in 1830 under the auspices of the then Prussian king, Friedrich Wilhelm III, who, vis-a-vis his palace, wished to create an island dedicated to art, an island which is to indicate a Prussian love of knowledge, the preservation of knowledge, the presentation of knowledge, the conservation and the enlargement of knowledge. And he does so in what will eventually become a series of 5 buildings. But importantly, Museum Island is an island. To access it, we must cross a bridge, so to speak, as if we are crossing from the terrestrial world into a world of the celestial, presented to us via art. In essence, these buildings are garden pavilions in an Arcadian landscape. Museum Island, a presentation of Prussian desire to learn, to acquire and to present knowledge. The first of these buildings is the one behind me. Opened in 1830, it's the oldest museum building. And as I look at it, the architect Schinkel does not create a temple so much as he creates an agora, an open space of communication in a Grecian city with this beautiful colonnade. But look above the column. You will notice on the Attica, I no longer have a Prussian royal family crest, but I have eagles. Eagles, the national symbol of Prussia. And where I am situated, a garden, formerly the pleasure grounds of the palace. Now, before we leave, in order to explore each of these beautiful museums in their own accord, let's take a look at that lovely German granite bowl that we see behind me in front of you. This amphor-like situation. When created in 1830, this was considered to be a wonder of the New World. Prussian granite that has now been engineered and aestheticized to create a Grecian fountain-like atmosphere. Elevated from the ground, it is, by its material, suggesting a new Germany, or better said, a new Prussia, post-Napoleon, that however is embracing classical ideas and ideas of humanism as well. Come and join me as we explore Museum Island this morning and several of its collections. Now, Museum Island is actually situated on the island where the royal family was situated in a beautiful palace. Now, in 1905, the building now behind me with this glorious dome, so suggestive of St. Peter's, was instigated. And it was the private chapel, open to the public, of Kaiser Emperor Wilhelm II. A wonderful example of the architecture of Germany 1900. Always looking to the past to validate this very new empire. Now, Kaiser Wilhelm II was living in a beautiful, extensive, expansive palatial building, the Berlin Palace. And the Berlin Palace is now directly behind me. Now, I have brought you over to this area here to have a wonderful view to the front facade of the Berlin Palace. You will notice the entrance doors, tripartite, similar to Constantine's Gate, so typical of the early 18th century, and looking at Rome as an inspiration. The octagonal tambour or the drum upon which the dome is situated is not only reminiscent of Brunelleschi's dome in Florence, but as well as the space of Charlemagne's chapel in Aachen, creating then a relationship back to Aachen and Charlemagne, and then of course with the beautiful bronze dome, so suggestive of St. Peter's. And this was the home of the Prussian king from the early 18th century to and through the imperial time period. After the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II in November of 1918, the building essentially became a museum. And post-World War II, or better said, during the course of World War II, it was relatively heavily damaged. In 1949, the then leader of East Germany, Walter Ulbricht, ordered the destruction of all of the remains, which were extensive. Nothing remained from the Berlin Palace excepting one door case. Post-German unification in 1990, there was a very conscious effort to remove what had been situated here, the Parliament of the Republic, an East German parliamentary building, and to replace it with the newly built Humboldt Forum, in which we have a restoration and reconstruction of the beautiful historical walling. Everything you see behind me is new, and within these walls, new museum, a museum dedicated to the non-Western art of Berlin's collections, Japan, Africa, North America, South America, creating then a beautiful collection of non-Western art, and by placing that at Museum Island, giving non-Western art a canonization, that it is as beautiful and as validated as art from the antique Grecian, Roman, and Egyptian world. We are here just in front of the beautiful Bode Museum. The Bode Museum today houses sculpture from 1400 to 1800. You will notice the building looks like a palace, like the residence of a king, and exactly that is what they were intending to do, to create a building that would represent as well the royal or the imperial family of Germany. Look at the beautiful copper dome, so reminiscent of their palace, the beautiful colonnaded portico, so that when we enter into the building, it is as if we are entering into a palace of art from 1907. With special permission arranged via Academy Travel, we will go into the building to look at its beautiful interior. Allow me once again to introduce you to the Bode Museum from the interior. From 1907, we note already that actually the architecture, the material is slightly different than, for example, the Old National Gallery. Here, it is intentionally more palatial, so that at this area of Museum Island, there's a much greater relationship to, for instance, the ideas of the Berlin Palace, creating a monarchical, kingly atmosphere to the extraordinary building. The word Bode does not tell us what's actually in this glorious building. Bode, however, William Bode, is the first director of this sculpture collection and much of Museum Island in approximately 1900. And Bode, just to give you an instance, was a major operative in the rediscovery of Donatello, for instance, in the late 19th century going into the early 20th century, creating for Berlin then a magnificent Donatello collection. But he is also instrumental in the greater appreciation of medieval and early Renaissance sculpture from the German-speaking world. And let's just begin with this magnificent piece from Prague, 1380. Now, depicted to us is St. Agnes with her lamb, as opposed to a Madonna with a child. But Agnes from 1380 is a magnificent example of what we would refer to as a schöne Madonna, a beautiful woman, usually a Mary, the mother of Jesus. But eventually, by the late 14th century, there's a certain standardization of the feminine in the sculptural moment. So as I begin to look at Agnes, you notice that in essence, there's very little corporality to Agnes in favor of a great creativeness in the textiles that surround Agnes, that emphasize Agnes and her charisma. And this is a major component to what is referred to as the beautiful Madonna, the schöne Madonna. So as we look, we notice that there's a wonderful linear fold, that there's a curvilinear fold that is accentuated by the gold, suggesting brocade, that sweeps up to her middle finger and then sweeps over again to the position of the lamb. So I have a magnificent sweep firstly, as we are looking at it, to the left and then up to the right. This reduces our ability to imagine an actual hip. So I have one layer of creativity, and that creativity is much more based upon the textiles than any exposure of the corporal position, which has reduced the elongation of the fingers, a slight elongation to the neckline, and a slight elongation to the facial features, creating then, in essence, this beautiful S-line to the Madonna. Now, this can be referred to in reference to this sculpture at this moment here. In the very early 14th century, instigated in particular via the Dominicans, but not exclusively, new forms of religious life for the lay are being instigated. And to facilitate this, new ideas in art, or better said, new genres of art, are created, particularly in the sculptural. And these are referred to as vespers. And a vesper is that which is a icon or a sculpture to the Passion of Christ, or for example here where we see the young John, the young apostle, laying his head on the chest or the pectoralis of Jesus Christ. With this new meditative contemplative art that is to facilitate the meditative and the contemplative, there are renewals in art as well, so that suddenly I have a great fluidity to the art that's being developed that we see very, very nicely at, for example, this line from the fingers of Christ down. You notice that these folds in the young John bring us towards and intensify as we come to his right arm. This right arm then brings us to his fingers, which are clasped firmly into the fingers of Christ, and then following his arms back to the hair of Christ, and then down again. So I have a wonderful amalgamation in the composition. As you look at this, you will notice that in a manner very similar to the Agnes that we've just looked at, that there's a great gentle composition to the facial features, to the thematization. Think of Agnes carrying a lamb, Jesus embracing John. John the younger was his favorite, as John was literally the youngest, but as such, he was also the purest in soul and in physical. All of a sudden, I begin to notice that the moment of art is to depict gentle. And that's exactly what this is called, the gentle style. Now, this was created, and much of the Vesper content or genre was firstly instigated at Lake Constance. So think of Lake Constance being a communicator to today's Switzerland, today's Austria, today's Germany, to the Rhine River. So in a relatively rapid time span, these ideas are generated, or rather, better said, further throughout all of Central Europe. This is 1390, so this is just coming to an end of the gentle style. And just so we are a little bit aware, beginning in the 1420s, up there in Flanders, think Ghent and Bruges, and to a certain extent Brussels, we begin to note an early Renaissance. And the early Renaissance creates a much more harder, a realism, an emphasis on the contour line, such as, for example, Roger van der Weyden, or a little bit earlier, Jan van Eyck. Now, with all of that said, I would suggest let's move on. Let's go into the next rooms. By the 1460s, in the Netherlands in particular, there are new means of communicating the ideas of a schöne Madonna. Now, the schöne Madonna, the beautiful Madonna, is not thrown away, but rather is reinterpreted. And this is done under the auspices of a fellow, Nicholas Gerhard van der Leyden. Nicholas Gerhard is the first to recognize that I can create two layers of creativity. I can express the charisma of the Madonna, not only via her textiles, but also via her corporality. And this revolutionizes sculpture. Now, working in lime wood, such as here, What van der Leyen will do is, for instance, indicate to us that the Madonna actually has a leg. You see this very nicely. How then the knee extends out, and this knee then instigates right here, which we did not see at the Agnes, comes down, instigates its own folding system that then creates a wonderful volume and furthers the corporality, or our cognition of the corporality of the Madonna. You will notice that her textiles do not incorporate or flow over into the entire body, so that they have now suddenly a second layer of creativity, the corporality, but also then the textiles. And when this is instigated following the painting ideals of Jan van Eyck, Roger van der Weyden, suddenly I begin to notice a much greater expressionism in the folding that becomes much more angular, giving us much more contour line than those soft, gentle folds of Agnes. So for example, if I take a look up here, I notice how angulated the fold is, how sharp, I should say, how precise the contour line is at this point here, but opening up her cloak at this point and at this point as well. Following Nicholas Gerhard van der Leyen, who makes his way all the way from the Netherlands through Ulm down to Vienna, working and living in Würzburg on the Main River, so think today's northern Bavaria, Franconia, is of course perhaps the most well-known and most beloved of the German lime wood sculptors. And this fellow is named Tilman Riemenschneider. And Riemenschneider will work exclusively in lime or in German lindenwood. And lime wood is very soft cellular. So with lime wood, you can create much greater intensity of folding. You can create a certain angularity in the folding that does not work so well in northern German sculpture, which is done out of oak. And in the 1490s, Tilman Riemenschneider was commissioned by the Teutonic Knights, who had a station in what is called Munerstadt. Munerstadt, today's northern Bavaria. And the patron saint of the Knights of the Teutonic Knights is Mary Magdalena. And for them, he creates a magnificent high altar. Now, this is a model of the high altar in Munerstadt, which no longer exists as such. And you will notice it begins with a predella. The predella with the four evangelists, I'll show you those in the original in just a second, coming into the retable, the centerpiece, which is the legend of Mary Magdalena. There were four side panels, so he's activating a very stage-like altar situation as opposed to a triptychon, and what is essentially referred to as a chest, a box. And then carrying up into a very ornate, organic situation, not dissimilar to what we would experience in reliquaries with the ornateness in the wood and crowned at the top by a Madonna and child. So what Tilman is doing is begin with a very, very terrestrial, very heavily materialized position here, and the further up we go, creating greater and greater transparency and dematerialization. In the predella, the base of the altar of Mary Magdalena, were the four evangelists. And here they are as sculpted by Tilman Riemenschneider. You will notice that each of these sculptors, each of the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, is quite individualized. Further to this is the monochromatic. And Riemenschneider is the first to suggest that the wood and the wood itself, with its dendrological rings, is of great beauty. And when I refuse, or when the artist does not create a variochromatic, but remains within the naturalism of the wood, then all of a sudden there's a greater idealism. I no longer have that realism of the painted figure that suggests a wonderful relationship to the terrestrial, to the world as we know it. But rather, by maintaining the monochromatic and the beauty of the wood, then suddenly I am forced as a participant, as a viewer, to consider these as terrestrial, idealized personages. Not only does the Bode Museum contain a collection of European sculpture from approximately 1300 to approximately 1800, it is also the home of the Byzantine collection, which includes, for example, this wonderful mosaic restored mid-19th century, dedicated to St. Cosmos and St. Damien, and in the conch, this shell-like apparatus, Michael, a Christ resurrected figure with that magnificent cross, and Gabriel. Above, a Christ Pantocrator, so a Christ enthroned. The utilization of the garden effect is that which we would see a little bit more in a Roman Byzantine. The magnificence of the bird world in the arch that surrounds, absolutely magnificent tesserae in gold grounding, but also in the chromatics as well. And this is just one of the many glories of the Byzantine collection here in Berlin. In the Bode, not only do we have Northern European sculpture, but also a wonderful collection of Italian sculpture, from the Renaissance of Donatello in Florence to the Rome of 1800. And Rome 1800 means, in terms of the sculptural process, Canova. Antonio Canova, originally from the area of Venice, sent in 1798 to Rome. And he creates a terpsichore, the muse of dance. We are just at the moment of hearing the music. When I look at the symbols, they've produced the music and she's removed them in order to bring her hands almost in an ecstatic motion upward. Let's go down, however, to the feet. Now, if this were to be a classical statue, Canova would not be able to move the leg, the left leg, behind the right leg. But every moment of the sculptor's scalpel is designed to indicate the instigation of the movement in the auditory. So that terpsichore is not only in movement, but that movement is in response to the auditory. Absolutely marvelous in terms of both a communication of the auditory and a communication of dance. We'll notice that the terpsichore is on a pediment, and there's an aperture here. And now look, do you notice that between the pediment and the actual base, there's this line? And that gives us a clue as when the Russian ambassador finally received his commission, the terpsichore arrived, and it was the center of his dining room table. And the dining room table was created to accommodate terpsichore. Hence, the fact that the base is somewhat above the pediment. And when the guests were dining, house personnel were below, and where you see this aperture, I'll call it like a key. And that key could be turned to wind up the mechanism, and suddenly the terpsichore began to dance. The terpsichore actually began to revolve. So as the diners dined, the dancer danced. As I mentioned earlier, the first director of this museum, and after whom the museum is named, was amongst the first to create a rediscovery, a reappreciation of the great Donatello in Florence, Donatello being there in the mid-15th century, patronized, of course, by the great de' Medici family. And it is Donatello who is the first to create, since the antique, a bas-relief. And amongst those very first bas-reliefs is the Madonna Pace, the Pace being the patronage family. And following the ideas of the great Florentine intellectual Alberti, he creates a wonderful window in which then the Madonna and Child are situated. And typical of the Florentine is a wonderful linear composition, beautifully mathematicized, as if he's looking at new concepts in painting, Mother and Child, and bringing them to the three-dimensional in the bas-relief here with the Madonna Pace. This arrived into our collection in the early 1890s, as does much of the Donatello work that we see today in this room and others in the Bode. At the Museum Island, perhaps the most well-known museum is the Pergamonmuseum, the Museum of Antiquities, Architectural Antiquities, which is now behind me. Now, the Pergamonmuseum opened in 1930, designed specifically to take these monumental architectural features, the Market Gate at Millet, the Babylonian Processional Boulevard, and the Great Altar of Pergamon, one of the great monuments of the antique world. Now, at the moment, the Pergamon is permanently closed until about 2030 in order to develop a fourth wing. And when you look behind me, you notice these red barricades and construction, and there will be a fourth wing. Now, with that fourth wing, there will be a connection to the building, to my left, the James Simon Gallery. And the James Simon Gallery, in turn, connects to the Egyptian Museum. So that all together, when all is completed, I will be able to do what is essentially a figure eight from the world of Egypt to the world of the classical antiques, of Babylon, of Millet, of Pergamon, and back again, creating one of the great museums to the antique in the world. We are now standing in front of the Neues Museum, so typical of Museum Island. Today, the new museum, and it was designed to do so, houses our magnificent Egyptian collection, as well as the smaller pieces from the Roman and Grecian collections. But before we talk further about the museum itself, as we've been walking, you've discovered all of these beautiful columns, the walls of the new museum, with all of this damage. This damage was done in World War II, not through air raids, but in the last 5 days of April 1945, the Soviets are in Berlin exclusively. They are utilizing tanks, heavy artillery, but on the ground floors, on the streets, with the intent of hoisting the Soviet flag on the Reichstag by the 1st of May 1945. And this is what we are experiencing here at the New Museum and on that wonderful colonnade. The New Museum has recently been restored, and today it houses our Egyptian collection, as I said, most famously the wonderful bust of Nefertiti. This glorious time in Egyptian art, history, theology from approximately 1350 BC. Today we can enter into the New Museum via this door or via the wonderful James Simon Gallery. Standing in front of the Old National Gallery, developed in 1878, which we will shortly go into, was designed to indicate German art, an art of a nation. But the architect was actually looking at plans for a mausoleum, a funerary monument to the most famous of the Prussian kings, Friedrich II. Now, this monument was to be built by 1798. It was never built. And as I look at the Old National Gallery, I notice a really pedestaled, temple-like quality to the architecture. And I also notice, however, like a mausoleum, a rather accentuated, almost exaggerated entrance formulation that is further emphasized by this grandiose staircase that brings me to the equestrian statue above of the instigator of the Old National Gallery, the mid-19th century Prussian king, Friedrich Wilhelm IV. But as we approach the entrance, you will notice that we are going from light to dark, so that when we enter into the building itself, we leave terrestrial via a dark passage that is very reminiscent of a mausoleum-like concept. And only as we are actually in the building do we then enter into light again. So that not only is this a built under those plans honoring the great Prussian king Friedrich II, but it is also a means of communicating nation. When we are experiencing art, we are experiencing a celestial world. And with all of that said, let's go into the Old National Gallery. And again, through a special permission arranged via Academy Travel and the National Museums of Berlin, we are going to view the wonderful art collection alone in the interior. And come on in with us. And now that we're here in the Old National Gallery here in Berlin, opened in 1878, we begin to understand how beautiful the interior of the building is, not only in its own right, but as well for the exhibition of art. Now, very briefly, the building post-1990 and German unification eventually was closed for restoration and reopened in the year 2001. So that today the Old National Gallery houses and displays very beautifully the art of the German 19th century from 1789 to approximately 1900. And on the upper floor here, we are introduced already to a great patron of the collection, that is Alexander Humboldt. Alexander Humboldt, a great Berlin scientist, of course famous for his expeditions to South America and to Russia. And just so we are aware, in 1828, Alexander Humboldt had returned from his Russian expedition, which had been sponsored by the royal family, by the Tsar's family. And Nicholas I, in appreciation thereof, had actually presented to him this wonderful vase of Russian Avertine, beautifully polished. And Humboldt gives this one, or Humboldt's estate, better said, gives the vase to the collection in 1878 upon the opening of this very beautiful building. Today, the Old National Gallery, with its wonderful collection of 19th century art, is a wonderful place, a delightful place to explore the art of the great German romantics, Caspar David Friedrich, carried on to the mid-19th century with Menzel, whom we'll take a look at a little bit later, and of course, Max Liebermann, the great German impressionist, who at the same time creates a renewal in German art as well. From the National Gallery, or better said, the Old National Gallery, when constructed, its position on Museum Island was to be in a relationship to the Berlin Palace. And one great moment is, of course, the opening of the doors here on the Piano Nobile, which brings us to a beautiful colonnaded portico. And that portico then brings us visually across to the Berlin Palace itself. Though the collection has its origins in a bourgeois collection, which had been donated to the state in the 1830s, much of the collection had actually been and remained in the possession of the royal family until 1919. And we notice that then there is a wonderful conjunction between palace, which you have just seen looking across, and of course, collection itself. The man on the equestrian statue is the King of Prussia, who in turn was the great patron of Caspar David Friedrich, whose paintings are iconic to the collection. So, for instance, the Monk on the Sea, a singular person, a singular man, engulfed in space. Behind him, the enormity of the energy of the waves of the sea in compliance to or in alignment with the enormity, the never-ending, the infinitesimal of the skies. Now, where we are now, this wonderful entree is created by the architect of the building, Perseus, not only as an entree to the various wings of the building on the Piano Nobile, but it's so typical of this time of the 1870s, 1880s, historism, a little touch of a Beaux-Arts with its love of many different materials, the black marble columns, the porphyr stone, the polychromatics, the statuary, and of course, the star-filled heavenly cupola, which is a reminiscence to Carl Friedrich Schinkel, upon whom many of the ideas that are expressed in this building are based. Allow me to introduce to you one of the great German artists of 1900, a man by the name of Max Liebermann. Now, Max Liebermann is originally from Breslau, which is in today's Poland, and eventually arrives into Berlin in the early 1880s. And with Max Liebermann, we begin to see the introduction of Impressionist art techniques into the German art world. And very interestingly, with Max Liebermann, not only do we have an introduction of Impressionist art techniques and ideas into the German art, but at the same time, we begin to see the introduction via Max Liebermann of ideas that can be considered to be a renewal of German art, or even a reformation of German art. And as I look at the self-portrait by Liebermann, I recognize that he is following in the footsteps, in terms of self-portraiture, of Rembrandt, the great golden age doyen of Dutch art. Now, if I begin to look at Liebermann's art, his self-portrait, I notice an emotional circumstance that is being contributed to the painting via the lights and shadows on the facial features. I recognize that he has no fear of presenting himself not as a patrician, but as a creator, a person of renewal, with his easel, with his palette, with his brush. Similarly, when I begin to look at the brushstroke, of Liebermann, I recognize a very rapid application of the material onto the canvas, almost to the point where we begin to consider, did he even finish this self-portrait? There is a touch of the non-finito, the non-finished. And when Liebermann does this technique that he employs, suggesting that his series of self-portraits are not finished, his life is not finished, his creativity is not finished as well. Now, with this extraordinary love of that which is the Dutch, and this actually rather anti-impressionistic palette, let's take a look at this painting here. The flaxen weavers, or the thread makers, which is so iconologically filled with the idea of the weaving of our fates and the inability of the human experience to control one's own destiny, at least to a certain extent. Now, I have just mentioned that Liebermann is working in an Impressionist art technique that would apply in particular to the brushstroke. However, at the same time, he's creating a rather anti-impressionist palette, almost working into grisaille as we look at this extraordinary painting, really removing us from those pastel colors of the French in order to re-establish the autonomy of German art while maintaining a very real contemporary aspect. Now, similarly, when I begin to look at this painting, I recognize that which will be often a German consideration of art, and that is a wonderful interiorization. Max Liebermann presents us with an enormous order, creating out of the chaos of space an order of space that is exemplified via, for example, the planks, going from our space, bringing us in, stopping with this wonderful woman at this point here, allowing us into the painting, and these diagonal lines, or orthogonals, being counterpaired with the diagonal lines of the beams of the roof, creating then a wonderful juxtaposition of roof and floor. At the same time, the beams of the ceiling begin to exemplify the lines of the threads that the women are actually creating. So all of a sudden, he creates also, relatively unlike French Impressionism, a wonderful order and structure to the space, so that on the left, that diagonal which follows the floorboards, where the young boys are actually moving the spinning wheels, a wonderful diagonal that then accepted by the diagonal of the women who are holding the thread, weaving the thread, I'll use that word, in their counter positions. It is very rare that French Impressionism ornaments the space. An example thereof would be Calibo and his floor strippers. And that creates a little bit of a curled ornament on the floor of the painting. That concept is then reiterated, or better said, amplified by Liebermann on his flooring. So that all of a sudden, the flaxen that has fallen to the ground is exhibited for us in a means that is quite similar to Calibo. A magnificent painting indicative of all that Liebermann is, and I may add, and what we begin to notice is that Liebermann, with his palette, with his themes, with his interiority, really does begin to create a new German art. Let's go into the next room, and let's just do a simple comparative to the French Impressionism. Now, in Germany, French Impressionism was first collected in what is an area not too terribly far from Essen in northwest Germany. And in Berlin, collecting of Impressionism really comes a little bit later. And in the very late 1890s, this wonderful painting by Manet was introduced into this collection. A man, a woman, in a winter garden or a conservatory. And yet when this was applied and opened to the public in exactly this building, it was scandalous. And Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was a little bit conservative in terms of his artistic taste, actually had it removed, only to be reapplied into the museum in 1921. Well, what was the scandal? The scandal was two things. Number one, as you can see, this very beautiful woman has her one hand ungloved. That was very poor. And then they are not looking at one another. Now, Manet had already received enormous criticism due to his 1864 Olympia, which hangs in Paris. And Olympia had no emotional circumstance to her. To this day, Olympia has no emotional circumstance that is exhibited. She is almost as if she is in a mask. And exactly those ideas are being applied in particular to the facial features of this wonderful woman. Now, in spite of the scandal that the painting created due to the ungloved hands, it's actually a very beautifully organized and structured painting. So, for instance, when I begin to look at the female figure here, the wife, I notice that it utilizes yellow in a very, very rapid application, so that this woman becomes framed in yellow, the yellow parasol, the yellow or golden toned gloves, and that all enframed within her wonderful, I suppose in today's world we would say, the golden or the yellow fascinator that she is actually working. This woman was really quite famous, an American who was a hat designer in Paris, who enjoyed having all sorts of wonderful tete-a-tetes with handsome young French men. That apparently is being somewhat communicated to us via the lack of a view to one another. A relatively small collection of French Impressionism, however, an exquisite as well. And with all that said, that concludes, with all that said, our wonderful excursion into the world of 19th century German art. We again thank Academy Travel for arranging our special permission, as well as the National Museums of Berlin for allowing this opportunity to occur.